real pleasure to be part of a stimulating PDW like this, and that's very timely. And as you allude to, it's a very good question. It's a challenging question, something that we've even struggled with in the writing, because what's easy to sort of study and isolate is one thing, and that which is non-deliberative is a little bit more elusive, right? So speaking to it, I think also for those that may be a little bit newer in this space, it may be germane to step back and consider entrepreneurial action and what this PDW in a sense, I believe, is about. And so in that regard, right? So logically, when we're thinking about entrepreneurial action, we're thinking about actions people take towards starting for the startup venture, right? Maybe developing a business plan, a prototype, seeking financing, or other activities, right? And we pause, we think a little more broadly. We realize, okay, what is entrepreneurial is not necessarily just about startup business venturing, but also other forms of venturing, maybe venturing or innovation within existing organizations, or social venturing, or more broadly, various types of entrepreneurial activity, right? And while the ultimate interest for many entrepreneurship scholars and practitioners is, of course, some form of viable organization or innovation, there's various issues that we need to not overlook, right? One, there's also many other outcomes and processes of potential interest and relevance. And for example, individual mental health, workforce integration versus, say, unemployment or recidivism or team dynamics or positive or negative deviance, or various other multi-level type outcomes as well. But even if our interest is in the creation and performance of new ventures, ultimately, there's a tremendous amount of aggregation of entrepreneurial action, not to mention environmental selection and chance and other factors that are ultimately form whether or not there's an organization or innovation emerges, right? And then as it relates to even specific entrepreneurial actions, what's micro and what's macro, right? I mean, if we take the example of writing a business plan or making a prototype, on one hand, they're one of many potential entrepreneurial behaviors that, for example, the PSED considers, and neither are sufficient or necessary condition for venture formation. Yet, even considering those, based on the extensive amount of sort of granular actions that go into creating a business plan or creating a prototype, those in themselves could be kind of considered macro actions, right? So just as this kind of what is micro versus molar human behavior varies from within sociology or within social psychology or within cognitive psychology to neuropsychology, there is a lot of level of analysis and aggregation challenges that this space within entrepreneurship that of course we face. As it relates to the non-deliberative and entrepreneurial action, the PDW's topic, as I'm saying, and thank you for, as you sort of pointed out, I mean, me and my colleagues, really tried to grapple with this because it would never, I mean, it's not at all my contention that, the non-deliberative, can subsume or explain entrepreneurial action, all of it, right? Rather, it's, nor that all entrepreneurs are a certain way, no, right? But just like other human behavior, that this broad spectrum is necessary to understand it, right? That which ranges from highly deliberative, which certainly exists, right? And actually, I'm going to start to point out in the paper, I think that you're mentioning, that often I think many entrepreneurs would benefit maybe from exercising more judgment, but to understand what underlies entrepreneurial action, or at least some entrepreneurial action, dialing all the way down to the very non-deliberative as well, is also important. So that's I think the gist of it, and also I think that's also something that's nicely suggested by your title of 50 Shades of Entrepreneurial Action. That it's there's many shades, and there's a big spectrum, and it's maybe multidimensional in a sense as well. In terms of how it shapes entrepreneurial action, I'd say there's many possible ways, more than we can certainly cover in a short video here as I wrap up. But maybe as a point for later conversation in the synchronous, I'd say it's often sort of the seed or sort of the spark, and also potential fuel from which entrepreneurial action comes, right? Sometimes maybe it's this unreasoned kind of reaction or impetus to the way things are that impels subsequent entrepreneurial thought and action, right? But then in terms of retrospection, rationalizing, or even sort of sense making of what we did, and then also communicating that, it's apt to become colored with logic of more traditional form. So. research and where it's at, I mean, I begin by recognizing, look, over the past decades, entrepreneurship literature has made great advancements, in identifying and better understanding some of the many different, diverse impetuses toward entrepreneurial action and the, connection to important entrepreneurial outcomes. And yeah, indeed, as others have been trying to put forth, is especially considered through the lens of that which is non-deliberate. That it's still relatively early stage, and there's a rapidly growing number of papers that one way or another I think are engaging that type of drivers, but it may not be called that as such. That's why I think it's an interesting sort of meta organizing way to sort of say, look, these are not the judgment driven behavior, right? It's behavior driven from something else, right? And in terms of other work I'm involved with, aspects I suppose for the review process I shouldn't disclose too much, but I'd point to the existing papers I have that you can find on Google Scholar, and also a number of growing number of papers and other excellent scholars active in this area. That to get a start on some of that, there's I think 3 special issues that I can send you links to that I'm sure you're aware of, but might be helpful for anybody watching this video. You can maybe put in the comments. One is in ET&P, another in AMP, and a forthcoming one for JVV. And I can send you links to that I think might be helpful for folks. And so it's something that I think, there's a lot of activity out there by interesting folks. I think this PDW will bring a lot of that together. Especially for the live session, but I'd say, look, there's considerable research opportunities, and the challenge, especially in the non-deliberative space, is this issue of sort of observability, and how then communication and sense making, and narrativity and design and all these things really complicate trying to sort of capture what, in a sense, was may or may have not been deliberative at the point it was actually done, right? And so in terms of what that means, though, I think that ideally, but quite possibly some sort of multi-method studies, right, with sort of diverse, probably cross-disciplinary, collaborators, right? That may be involving sort of historical methods and artifacts and big data, for example, or cognitive, or clinical psychologists and psychiatrists, and/or, for example, animal behaviorists, right? I mean, if you figure most behavior, 99.999 of this planet is non-deliberative, and all these species since the inception of life have done and evolved just fine. Yes, we humans are quite unique in our capacity to reason and judgment, and that is incredibly important for our advancement. But there's a whole lot more under the tip of the iceberg that remains relevant, and trying to study that, of course, is very difficult, right? So I would say, broad collaborations with multi-methods, and that's also just fun. I mean, I think it's partly why most of us got into this field of academia, is the ability to ask big questions and challenging ones, and wind up collaborating with folks in potentially very different technical as well as sort of theoretical backgrounds that also makes the work fun. And actually, there's one paper that is I think it's in press with AMR that I can send you the link to that I have with Rick and Wim, that if interested in the topic of historical methods and how that might begin to be an opportunity, I'll send that your way as well.
So that's interesting. If you can share the link, that will be much appreciated. Additionally, you've talked a fair amount about narratives and sense making, and I'm wondering if there are some opportunities there as well. Any thoughts on that?
I think so, in a large way. I mean, that's a little bit what in that short piece that we try to begin to explain. We have a larger piece that seeks to take that further, but basically in how that's a real challenge. And I think a bit of that is sort of encapsulated by what we're trying to do in that AMR paper.
So that's all the questions we have, Professor Lerner. Anything that you might want to add in terms of thoughts, ideas, suggestions, advice, as people who may be interested in this space start projects or build projects around this idea, broad idea of non-deliberate logics aspects?
Well, it's not specifically related to that. It relates to both that and the other dimensions of PDW and these types of opportunities. That actually I just read I think it's the introduction to the special issue by Dean Shepard, Johan Wickland, and Dimo of research, right? That especially for young scholars or anybody that's just thinking of diversifying into something like this, that can, I think, be very helpful framework to sort of think about how do I harness these things that I've observed, that I have reason to believe in my own research, and I think that can be a good mechanism for them, whether it happens to be about, in my case, some of the non-deliberative, or bringing their own methodologies or these types of things to the table.